All right, so we've gotten to the point now where you're understanding that the outer ear is catching and funneling vibrations down to the tympanic membrane. And when those vibrations, those sound waves, move the tympanic membrane back and forth, the ossicular chain is attached to that tympanic membrane. So that is the movement of the tympanic membrane is going to also move the ossicular chain. And that part of the ossicular chain, that is the stapes, interacts with the cochlea. And the stapes is going to push in on what is known as the oval window of the cochlea. And that'll send a wave of vibration through the fluid of the cochlea. But the positive pressure that is created when the stapes pushes in at the oval window is going to be released at a little area, a little opening below the oval window that is known as the round window. So when the stapes pushes in on the oval window, you see the round window bulge out because of the positive pressure the stapes is creating. And when the stapes is pulled back, you're going to see the round window be pulled back in due to the negative pressure within the fluid within the cochlea that action is creating. And we're going to get into more in depth as to what this actually is and what it actually means here in a minute. But I want you to see sort of the mechanics of what's happening.
Ear catches these waves. It faces forward and has a specially designed structure of curves helping us to determine the direction of the sound and also emphasize the frequencies used in human speech. Now that the sound waves are caught, they travel through the ear canal and strike against our eardrum, a thin membrane about 10 millimeters wide. Now that we receive the sound, the middle ear transfers this energy. The smallest bones in your body, the malleus, incus, and stapes, start in motion. The malleus is attached to the eardrum, and as the sound travels along, the force is amplified by leverage until it arrives at the stapes, which acts like a reversed piston, creating waves in the fluid of the inner ear. The most significant increase in pressure is caused by pneumatic amplification. The face of the stapes has a surface area of about 3.2 square millimeters, while the eardrum has a surface area of 55 square millimeters. Using this, along with leverage through the malleus and incus, the final pressure is 22 times greater than when the sound first arrived.
All right, so that is another quick walkthrough of the mechanics of how the middle ear changes acoustic energy into actual mechanical energy and delivers that mechanical energy via the stapes to the cochlea at the oval window. The last two muscles we're going to mention in this anatomy course are known as the tensor tympani and the stapedius muscle. So the tensor tympani, if I said, what does this do? You would probably guess it tenses the tympanic membrane. And you would be correct. And the stapedius tenses pulls on the stapes itself to hold it more still. So the purpose of these two muscles that are in your middle ear is to restrain the ossicular chain when there is a noise, when there is a sound coming into the ear that is so loud that if that energy is delivered to the cochlea, you will damage your cochlea. So if there's a very loud sound, a damagingly loud sound, if I walked into your room while you're sitting there quietly typing away with a snare drum, and I smack that snare drum as loud as I can, you would feel this tense up in your ear. If you've ever been at a club before the rock show starts and the band starts the sound check and the drummer's always the first one to like really check all his drums. You go from just a quiet club with people talking to all of a sudden like 100 and 150 decibel drum hit. You'll feel this in your ear. And essentially what's happening is that loud noise hits your tympanic membrane and moves it so quick that there's a signal that is sent to your brainstem, and your brainstem gets that signal and essentially says, we got some loud noise coming in that is going to destroy our cochlea, that's going to negatively impact our hearing. So rather than just allowing that loud noise, which is going to translate into a huge amount of energy passing through the ossicular chain to be delivered to the cochlea, the brainstem generates a motor plan that gets sent back to those two little muscles. And the tensor tympani pulls on the malleus to restrain the malleus, thereby restraining the eardrum to some degree. And the stapedius muscle tenses and holds on to the stapes to reduce as much as possible the movement of the stapes into the cochlea as it delivers that energy to the cochlea. So the acoustic reflex is trying to dampen the amount of energy, sound energy, that is being delivered to the cochlea, trying to reduce it to a level that's not going to damage your hearing. But here's the thing. We evolved the acoustic reflex in a paleo world, in a world where there weren't things like chainsaws and rock bands and jet planes. So the acoustic reflex is able to protect our hearing to some degree in a more natural environment where we are not exposed to unnaturally loud industrial sounds. But in modern society, where we are constantly exposed to unnaturally loud sounds, the acoustic reflex doesn't do so much to protect our hearing. All right, so now let's talk about two different ways in which we can stimulate the cochlea, which allows us to hear. So when the stapes is pushing into the oval window, pushing into the cochlea at the oval window, it's sending waves of vibration through the cochlea, which stimulates little cells within the cochlea in the fluid that are known as hair cells. And it's the stimulation of these hair cells that allows us to hear. So if you stimulate the hair cells in the cochlea, then you're stimulating hearing. We can stimulate the hair cells in the cochlea two primary ways. The first is the way that I've been explaining throughout the course of this lecture. We call this air conduction, meaning that the energy that is being delivered to the cochlea to stimulate the hair cells is passing through the air, being collected by the outer ear, transmitted to the middle ear, to be delivered by the ossicular chain at the oval window by the stapes to the cochlea. And by that action of the stapes creating waves of pressure within the fluid of the cochlea, we are able to move the hair cells, stimulating hearing. That's air conduction. But let's say you don't have a middle ear, but your cochlea is still intact. So sound cannot pass. So if you don't have a middle ear, or let's say you're missing the ossicular chain, you have something very wrong with your middle ear, or you just don't have one. Air can't move, vibrations can't move from the air into your cochlea. There's a missing link in the chain. But if your cochlea is still there inside the petrous portion of the temporal bone, we can take what is called a bone conduction hearing aid. And you've probably seen some individuals or some children running around with these on. It looks like a strap on their head. And it's got a little unit that is right here on the mastoid process of your skull. So it's pushing in on the temporal bone. And if you recall, the temporal bone is the bone that houses the cochlea. So if you vibrate the temporal bone, you are vibrating the cochlea because the cochlea is in there. And if you're vibrating the cochlea, you're vibrating the fluid within the cochlea. And if you're vibrating the fluid within the cochlea, you're stimulating the hair cells in the cochlea, and you're creating a situation where that individual, even though they may not have a middle ear or they have a seriously disordered or disabled middle ear, with a bone conduction hearing aid that delivers vibration to the mastoid process, to the skull, meaning the bone. By vibrating the bone, you are able to stimulate the cochlea using this technology and bypass the middle ear entirely. If some of you guys are swimmers, you're probably familiar with this technology. They have these, essentially their headphones for swimmers, so that when you're underwater, you're getting music delivered to your cochlea via bone conduction. Because how well does air conduction of sound work underwater? Not well, right? You put your headphones on, your normal headphones, and you go underwater, you're not going to hear anything. But there are special bone conduction headphones for individuals that swim. So that's air conduction and bone conduction, two different ways in which hearing can occur. Okay, so we have discussed the outer ear, which is the auricle and the ear canal. We have discussed the middle ear, which is the tympanic membrane and the ossicular chain. And we've touched on the cochlea as being your primary structure of hearing, as being filled with fluid, as having hair cells within the fluid, that the hair cells, when the hair cells get stimulated by vibrations moving through the fluid, then that stimulates hearing. So as long as you have a cochlea intact, you can have some form of effective hearing. But just because if you don't have a cochlea, or if your cochlea is damaged, then there's nothing you can do to compensate for that. It doesn't matter if you have an intact outer ear and intact middle ear. You have to have an intact cochlea to hear. So the inner ear, when we refer to the inner ear, we are talking about the cochlea, which is your primary structure of hearing, and we're also talking about the semicircular canals. Semicircular canals are these three loops that come off of the cochlea. Let's see, right here, and right here. And each of the semicircular canals are oriented in a different way. And the semicircular canals also are filled with fluid, but they are not responsible for hearing. They're responsible for helping you balance. So there's fluid within the semicircular canals. And when you move your head, the fluid within the semicircular canals shifts. And that sends a signal to your brain that tells your brain how you have moved in space. So semicircular canals have to do with balance. You have three parts of your body that are responsible, that contribute to your sense of balance. Your inner ear, meaning your semicircular canals, your eyes, and your brain. So if someone is having balance problems, it has to be one of three things. It has to be a problem with their eyes, a problem with their inner ear, or a problem with their brain. So if the cochlea is the primary structure of hearing, then within the cochlea, the part of the cochlea that houses the hair cells is the primary part of the cochlea responsible for hearing, and that is known as the organ of Corti. And this is what I want you to understand about the organ of Corti. To begin with, here's our oval window. So we have our stapes that pushes in at the oval window. All right, it's not the world's best stapes, but it'll do. The oval window opens into a chamber within the cochlea that runs the length of the cochlea that is known as the scala vestibuli. So the scala vestibuli runs the length of the cochlea. And the round window opens into another chamber within the cochlea that's known as the scala tympani. And the scala tympani also runs the length of the cochlea. And the cochlea is this spiral snail shell looking thing, right? So if you unfurled the cochlea, you would see the oval window right here opening into the scala vestibuli. And then there would be the round window that opens into the scala tympani. All right. So now, going back to the organ of Corti, what I want you to understand about it is that it exists within a third chamber that is between the scala vestibuli and the scala tympani. That's known as the scala media. And the scala media that houses the organ of Corti runs the length of the cochlea. So when you think of the organ of Corti, don't think of it as being like here on the cochlea or here on the cochlea. It's not at one place on the cochlea. The organ of Corti is within the scala media. That is the middle chamber of the cochlea, and it runs the length of the cochlea. So the organ of Corti runs the length of the cochlea. So here's a coronal slice of the cochlea. Here's the scala vestibuli. So this is the chamber that the stapes pushes in on to send a vibration running up the length of the cochlea. So positive pressure happens here when the stapes pushes in on the oval window. And that pushes down on this membrane that is between the scala vestibuli and the scala media, and that is called Reisner's membrane. So the positive pressure of the stapes pushing in on the scala vestibuli pushes down on Reisner's membrane. So we're going to move Reisner's membrane down like this, and that's going to displace the fluid within the scala media, creating a wave of positive pressure within the scala media. And if you're creating a wave of positive pressure and you're moving the fluid within the scala media, then you're pushing down on what is known as the basilar membrane. That is the membrane between the scala media and the scala tympani. And the basilar membrane has the organ of Corti. So when you've pushed down on Reisner's membrane, that pushes down on the basilar membrane. And when you move the basilar membrane, you're moving the organ of Corti. And when you move the organ of Corti, you're moving the hair cells within the organ of Corti. And when the hair cells are moved within the organ of Corti, it generates an electrical impulse that then gets sent up to the brain. And your brain receives that and interprets that and processes that and allows you to understand that as hearing. So, what we're saying is the outer ear collects acoustic energy. The middle ear takes that acoustic energy and turns it into mechanical energy and delivers that mechanical energy to the cochlea. The cochlea takes those waves of vibration within the fluid that's created by the mechanical energy that has been delivered to the cochlea, and through the stimulation of the hair cells, turns that energy now into electrical energy to be transmitted along the auditory nerve, the nerve between your ear and your brain, up to your brain. So whereas the middle ear is responsible for changing acoustic energy into mechanical energy, the cochlea is responsible for changing mechanical energy into electrical energy. Okay, now let me walk you through the process at the cochlea one more time with this image. I'm going to draw my stapes. So stapes pushes in on the chamber of the scala vestibuli. So that creates positive pressure, which is going to push down on Reisner's membrane, which is going to create a positive pressure within the scala media, which is going to push down on the basilar membrane, and the organ of Corti is in the basilar membrane. So when you displace the basilar membrane, you're moving the organ of Corti, which moves the hair cells within the organ of Corti. And when the hair cells are moved within the organ of Corti, they generate an electrical impulse that gets sent to the brain. The wire, the nerve that is the wire that connects your ears to your brain, is referred to as the acoustic nerve. This is the 8th cranial nerve. We're going to come back to it next week when we talk about neuro. So now let's back up and go through the basic steps of the physiology of hearing. Sound waves are collected by the auricle or the pinna and directed down into the external auditory meatus or the ear canal, where they strike the eardrum, causing it to vibrate. And the eardrum is connected to the ossicular chain. So when the eardrum moves, the ossicular chain moves. And as the ossicular chain moves, the stapes pushes in and out at the oval window of the cochlea. This movement of the oval window at the cochlea, makes waves of fluid, waves of pressure within the cochlea. And these waves of pressure, as they move through the cochlea, move the hair cells within the organ of Corti. And when the hair cells are moved within the organ of Corti, it generates an electrical impulse, a nerve impulse. And then that electrical impulse is transmitted from the inner ear, from the cochlea, up to your brain.